Hi, we are in Hebrews 3. Jesus is greater than Moses. And when we left off in chapter 2, we learned there were 8 victories that Jesus won for us at Golgotha or Calvary. Either one of those translations is correct. Number 1, he is crowned with glory and honor. And we now carry his glory and honor if indeed we are a born-again believer in Jesus. Number 2, he brings many sons and daughters into this glory, and we carry that message so that they can receive it. Number 3, he is made perfect through his sufferings. And we talked at length about what those sufferings are, that it narrows our focus, that through tribulations we enter God's kingdom. It burns off the dross, and if we are children of God and joint heirs with Christ, we will suffer persecution. We also learn that we are made holy because he is holy. Number 5, by his death, he destroyed the devil who held the power over death. And then number 6, he delivers us completely from the fear of death. Number 7, he is now our faithful high priest. And number 8, he helps us in every temptation. So far in the book of Hebrews, we have learned that Jesus is higher than the holy angels, and he has received the title of God. Now in this chapter, we're going to look at the comparison between Jesus and Moses. Now to us during this day, that may seem kind of ridiculous, but to the Jewish people, especially at that time, it's not ridiculous at all. They held Moses in very high esteem. So the Apostle Paul begins chapter 3 and verse 1 with a very interesting statement. It's very long and there's a lot to it. So as we go along, I'm going to pause and explain to you what he is getting at. So Hebrews 3 and verse 1, I'm going to start with the Passion Translation. And so, dear brothers and sisters, you are now made holy. Now, I'm going to pause right here and say that holiness is ownership. That is, God has purchased us for his own purposes. We'll continue. And each of you is invited to the feast or sharers of the feast of your heavenly calling, or you participate as partners in the heavenly calling. I'm going to pause again. The Greek phrase heavenly calling implies an invitation to a celestial feast. It could be translated, you are called to share the life of heaven. This calling originates in heaven and draws us into heaven where we're fulfilling our destiny. However, now in the Aramaic, this phrase can be translated called with a calling from heaven, which is the Aramaic title of the 3rd book of the Torah called Leviticus, and it refers to the calling of the Levites as priests. In other words, if we're not participating in our heavenly calling, we are missing out on heaven that has come to earth. Now let's continue. We're still in verse 1. So fasten your thoughts fully onto Jesus. Now the Aramaic can be translated Jesus the Messiah, and the word picture is something that has fangs and is grabbing a hold of something and won't let go. All right, continue. Whom we embrace, or with whom is our legally binding agreement as our apostle and king priest. Now, this verse means that God has joined these two together. The apostolic and the priestly ministries are joined together in Christ. Now, an apostle will always release God's people into their priestly calling to enter into the Holy of Holies without having to go through a system, a congregation, or a person. Now, what does that mean? It means that we, as Christians, encourage other Christians to discover the joy of knowing God personally Anyone who requires us to go through a system, a congregation, or a person is not a true apostle. The word king priest here is from the Aramaic, which uses a word for priest not of the Levitical order, which is really interesting because Jesus, if you remember, was not from the Levitical order. What tribe was Jesus from? If you said Judah, you would be correct. And the Levites were of the Levitical order. And then we have also the descendants of Aaron, who were part of the Levitical order. So this word here for priest is not Cohen, K-O-H-E-N, or some of your translations will be C-O-H-E-N, but the Aramaic word is Kumrea, K-U-M-R-E-A, and that is also the word that is used for Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law, and Melchizedek, which we're going to be talking about Melchizedek in this book of Hebrews. You can find that in Genesis 14:18, Exodus 2:16, Exodus 3:1, and Exodus 18:1. Now let's move on to verse 2, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. For he, Jesus, was faithful to God who appointed him, just as Moses served faithfully when he was entrusted with God's entire house. So we have this comparison where Moses and Jesus were both faithful to their callings. And you can see this in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 7. But Jesus gets the higher glory. Why? Okay, now I'm going to give you a word picture. So if you're able, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to picture that you are looking at a very well-built home or a very expensive sports car. Now, when you see a well-built home or a well-built automobile, what is it you want to know? Well, I want to know, what is that thing and who built it? Right? You kind of get excited about it, something that's designed well. But if that particular home or car uses cheap materials, it doesn't really matter what the design is, it's going to cheapen the product. Well, now we're talking about God is both the designer and builder of this house that we're talking about. And so therefore, he deserves more glory, more honor than the agent, the overseer, the owner, or the driver. And in this case, we're talking about Moses. Let's move on to verses 5 and 6. This is the New King James Version. And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which would be spoken of afterward. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast to the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope, firm to the end. Now, this goes back to the word picture of Abraham and Abraham's two sons. You remember his first son was of the slave girl Hagar, and the second son was the son of promise through Sarah, or Sarai, before her name was changed. And so Moses is God's servant, and Jesus Christ is the Son, S-O-N, and true heir. Now we go on to verses 7 through 11, where Paul is quoting Psalm 95 and verses 7 through 11. Now also picture this, if you will, if you can, close your eyes, this beautiful word picture. It says, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, oh, that you would hear his voice. Harden not your heart, as in at Meribah, or strife, as in the day of Massah, or testing in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work, or miracles. 40 years long I grieved with that generation and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Wherefore I swore in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. Now there's a difference between knowing God's acts, which are his miracles, signs, and wonders, and knowing God's ways. You know, we can be married to somebody or have a best friend, and we can know their acts, but we may not know their ways. And their ways gets back to an intimate relationship with God. It's knowing what pleases someone and what displeases someone. And so when you know their ways, you know how to please that person and what to avoid. That's what he's talking about. Verse 12, Passion Translation. So search your hearts every day. Take care, my brothers and sisters, and make sure that none of you has evil or unbelief hiding within you, for it will lead you astray or rebel against and make you unresponsive to the living God. Now, this statement is telling us that unbelief can hide. Well, how does it come out? How do you know what area of your life you have unbelief in? It will be tested. For example, God will ask you to do something, and you will either openly do it quickly or you will put it off. And sometimes that putting it off is because of unbelief. The root is unbelief. Now, God cannot lie. So if God tells you to do something, then he's giving you a vision for that thing, which means that he has gone before you and already given the provision, which means gone before. And so let's go ahead and just decide to give God our yes. No matter how ridiculous it sounds, no matter how outlandish it sounds, let's go ahead and give God our yes, because that is what builds trust between us and God. Now let's move on to verse 13 and 14 in the Passion Translation. This is the time to encourage each other and never be stubborn or hardened by sin's deceitfulness. For we are mingled with the Messiah if we will continue unshaken in this confident assurance from the beginning until the end. Now again, this is the second time he's emphasizing until the end. You can't quit. You know, once you're a Christian, you've got to be a Christian to the end, or there are consequences for that. So now the word picture in these two verses is that we are actually business partners with Christ, or we are woven together, or we are sewn together like a quilt. And then the liar comes along and he wants to pull us away or pull us apart, trying to intercept the life flow that is developing between us and God. And if we give into that lie or our own self-indulgence, then we have sinned against Christ or corrupted our relationship with God. That's what he's saying. Verses 15 and 16 are really talking about the parable of the soils or hearts, as we learned in Mark chapter 4. This parable is also found in Matthew 13, 3 through 8, and Luke 8, verses 4 through 10. So you know when God puts something in the Bible more than once, it is mucho importante. He wants you to really pay attention to that. So if you remember, I talked about that the heart is really made up of two parts. You remember what two parts? It's made up of our soul and our spirit. And then our soul is made up of three parts: our mind, our will, and our emotions. And if we can get our soul in line with our spirit, then it's easy to follow God. But those three parts of our soul kind of want their own way sometimes. And so let's look at Mark 4:4. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. So what is the seed, class? It's the Word of God, correct. And what is the path? This is the beaten down, trodden down, hard soil. So you can look at a field of grass and you can see where people have cut across the grass. That's the path. To drive home his point, the Apostle Paul asks some rhetorical questions of his audience. He says in verse 17, and again, this is the English Standard Version, and with whom was he, God, provoked for 40 years? Well, it was those who sinned, those who died in the wilderness. Verse 18, and to whom did he, God, swear that they would not enter his rest? Again, it was the disobedient. So in conclusion, verse 19, and this is a faithful version, Paul says, so we see that they were not able to enter in because of unbelief. Now, folks, the Lord takes unbelief very seriously. Why? Because by belief, we advance his kingdom, we enter into calming rest, and we receive the inheritance. Belief, like faith, has action. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope you go on my website, eileenonjesus.com, for more information. Thank you, and goodbye.